It's been 18 years since a team last drafted a receiver with the top two picks of the NFL draft. That was Calvin Johnson to the Lions. Can we expect Travis Hunter to likewise transform the league in the same way that Megatron did? We'll go through 20 years of fantasy data to find out what we should expect from this year's potentially underwhelming wide receiver class. There is value to be had, but where? Find out more on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we're talking wide receivers. If you've got any questions or comments, pop them in the comments below, or you can hit me up on Instagram or Twitter. If you'd like to check out my full rankings, they are over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Now, I've gone through 20 years of fantasy data to find out what we should expect from this year's wide receiver rookies. I've categorized them all based on their longevity. That is how many years they finished as a top 60 fantasy wide receiver, and their upside. That is their highest ever fantasy season. And I've categorized them into 8 categories that you can see below. If you disagree with any of the categories, feel free to hit me up in the comments and let me know. We'll be going through each of the tiers that I've called them, basically where they were drafted in the NFL draft, to talk about where we should expect these wide receivers to end up in fantasy this year and into the future. And we're starting off with all the top 10 picks over the last 20 odd years. And there have been quite a few of them, 24, which is quite a lot considering we're talking top 10. That's a lot more than most other positions. And of course, we have 2 this year in Travis Hunter and Ted McMillan. The question is, what should we expect from them? And the answer is, there's a lot of upside here. Over half the players to be drafted in this range in the last 20 years have at some stage had a top 10 fantasy season. Now, I know a top 10 fantasy season isn't that exciting, but these are guys you can put into your fantasy lineups and feel good about most years. Most recently, we've seen guys like Jamar Chase absolutely explode. He was the number 1 in fantasy last season. We basically knew from his rookie season, he was going to be very good. That doesn't mean these players are going to be superstars every year. We saw that with Chase when he had a down year a couple of years ago. But overall, these guys have the upside of being very positive. And that goes all the way back to guys like Larry Fitzgerald and Calvin Johnson, who, of course, gave us nearly a decade of amazing fantasy production. You also have the chance of, if things don't hit quite right, still getting a very good fantasy player. Guys like Drake London finally broke out last year, and it is important to remember these guys might not be amazing in their first year, as was certainly the case with London, while others will burn bright and then fall away. We saw that with Garrett Wilson, for example, that he's had some sparks, but realistically he's been pretty disappointing. Or Jalen Waddle, who started on fire and has slowly fallen away as the seasons have gone on. That's always a potential with these guys. But ultimately, this is the place you want to get your wide receiver. There is such a high boom rate here with a relatively low bust rate, but it is still possible based on the type of player. We do know guys like John Ross and Tavon Austin are, of course, smaller players who are always question marks who are mainly drafted based on their speed. That's not really how teams do things anymore. We haven't seen one of these bust players get drafted since 2017. Every single player drafted in the top 10 since then, and there have been 6 of them, have been very positive. So I would expect that we are going to get a top 10 fantasy season out of Hunter at some point in time, assuming he stays as an offensive player. I think that's the biggest question with Hunter. What can we expect from his play? Is he going to stay on offense? Is he going to be doing a lot of work on defense? Are they going to switch him around? That's the big question mark because he hasn't been drafted as a pure wide receiver. So we can't truly compare him to other top 2 picks. He is, however, clearly a top 2 talent based on the weakness of the draft class and his individual talent. So I do still think he's a very good pick for fantasy, but realistically, he doesn't really compare to these other guys. He would not have been drafted here if he wasn't also a good cornerback. Ted McMillan, on the other hand, was legitimately drafted for his talent, and it was arguably a very questionable pick. I know that there have been a lot of arguments to suggest that it was probably the wrong pick, and then Axe Tepper's come in to try to make things work because he messed up the Bryce Young pick, and he's just throwing wide receivers at it to try to justify his decision. I think there's a reasonable argument to be made, but realistically, we still have to acknowledge they picked a top 10 player on McMillan. There have been a lot of people saying he's been very impressive in OTAs, but others arguing that he doesn't really love football and he's not a very hard worker. So we could fall into any number of categories. Realistically, guys in that 8, 9, 10 region have a slightly lower hit rate than guys drafted in the top 5. We're talking about guys like Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Devonta Smith more recently, but also some guys like Mike Williams further back, who certainly had some positive years that took a little bit of time to get going. Having said that, you can still be picked in this range and be very successful, as you can in any range at the NFL draft. We just have to remember that this year was a relatively weak draft. McMillan probably isn't going in the top 10 in most years. For that reason, it's nearly better to compare him to the next group of players, which is from 11 to 24. This year, we did have a couple of players drafted between 11 and 24, but more in the low range with Egbuka and Golden. Now, the question is, how do they compare with these players? We've seen a couple of big booms in recent years. CeeDee Lamb and Justin Jefferson both came out and had massive years. Justin Jefferson was essentially number one player straight out of the gate and looked absolutely fantastic, and Lamb's had some excellent years as well. They've been among the best players in fantasy football. But that is not standard for this situation. There have not been a lot of other players in this range that have done very well. Some guys have taken a while to get going, like Jackson Smith to Jigba, and eventually gotten there. But most of them are just solid fantasy starters. We saw that from Zay Flowers, who every year pops up as kind of like a top 20-ish wide receiver, but he doesn't really have that upside. Or a Jordan Addison, who ends up playing behind a far stronger player. Plus, there are other guys who just never even reach that peak. We don't know what to expect from someone like a Quentin Johnston so far, but it doesn't look like he's going to get much higher than just a solid fantasy producer, especially with Ladd McConkey exploding there at the moment. And there have been plenty of busts. You get slightly more busts in this range than you do in the top 10. That makes perfect sense. These players have a lot more question marks. That's why they were drafted later. Now, to be fair, we haven't had as many recently, but certainly a lot more of these players have really struggled. So I think McMillan naturally fits into this range, and the same thing is the case with Egbuka and Golden. I think we can see in all of these players that they're not going to jump into a clear number one alpha role straight away. In the case of Egbuka and in the case of McMillan, there's just a lot of question marks as to whether being the alpha in the Carolina offense is even valuable. And I think you can argue with Golden. He might be the number one receiver, but he's more of a speed threat. He's not exactly going to suction up a whole lot of targets. And that puts him in a category that is closer to someone like a Jordan Addison or arguably a Will Fuller, rather than someone like a Lamb or a Jefferson. So we're not looking at those sort of players, and you shouldn't be expecting that sort of output from Egbuka or from Golden, especially with Egbuka. I think this nearly says more about Chris Godwin's health rather than anything else, but I can't imagine Egbuka is going to go in and be the number one when Mike Evans is hanging around. I feel like he's going to take some time to get going, and he has a far higher bust likelihood than a lot of players that are drafted in this range. Now, outside those guys, we have a couple of guys taken early in the second round. I've kind of grouped them together from picks 25 to 40, which is a little bit of a tricky situation, but these guys do tend to have very similar success rates. We get the occasional superstars, but even those occasional superstars, a lot of the time they weren't able to do it consistently. Deebo Samuel, of course, had one massive year, but other than that, he's just been a good producer. Same thing with Calvin Ridley. He had some issues, but he did have a big year. Most of these guys, on the other hand, are just kind of solid top 10 to top 20 options. Not quite in the top 10, but certainly the top 20 options. We've seen T. Higgins be very good, for example, but ultimately he's always playing behind Jamar Chase, and that's been the case of a lot of these guys. Brandon Ayuk has a lot of the time been playing behind a Debo and a George Kittle as well. They haven't been able to produce as high as they could because they ultimately often end up on very good teams who are drafting in this range because they're very good. On the other hand, with Higgins and Burton, they aren't drafting in this range because their teams are very good, but they potentially could be. Houston, for example, traded up to go and get Higgins, and they're just trying to improve their wide receiver room. They already have a number one in Nico Collins, so you'd expect that Jaden Higgins is going to be a lot more like a T. Higgins, only ultimately he is more of a bigger body player who is athletic, but it's not like he's great with separation. So there's a lot of question marks there, and we do have to question whether he could fall into that range like a Christian Watson, where he ends up being explosive at times, but ultimately not being a leader for his team. Luther Burton, on the other hand, more of a slot guy. And we've certainly seen those slot type players here who can do a lot of things, but not really an alpha option, ultimately end up being at best a fantasy backup rather than a really good fantasy starter. So even though there are some positives in this range, I don't feel particularly good about Higgins or Burton. and you'll see that soon when I go through and talk through my full rookie wide receiver ranking. Now, you can get some good quality fantasy starters in the later half of the second round. I think Trey Harris quite favorably compares to a lot of these guys who turned into studs and superstars. He's a big guy, pretty athletic, goes into an opportunity where there's not really a big alpha guy that he has to compete with. There's just a fair bit of talent around. We've seen AJ Brown, for example, be very good for a number of seasons, but I think Devontae Adams is not an unreasonable comp. I can imagine Harris going into that situation the same way that Adams did in Green Bay. Take a year maybe to get accustomed and then become a real alpha fantasy receiver. I feel like he has a lot of upside, but we have to be realistic here. Most of these guys aren't going to turn into fantasy starters. I think it's unlikely, for example, Jack Beck does. I think most of these guys ultimately end up being very disappointing for fantasy. We can see that happens with nearly 2/3 of the players that are drafted in this range. I think that's probably going to be the case with Beck, and it very easily could be with Trey Harris at all. It's just that Harris has the sort of upside that could see him comparing to those top guys, or even just falling into that sort of range of George Pickens, of being a solid fantasy guy who can be a good outside receiver for your team. So there's upside here, but don't get too excited. Realistically, if you can get a good fantasy starter, there's a lot more security in that than most of the guys drafted in this range, where over half the time they are going to bust. As we hit the third round, we've got a whole lot more talent in the third round, but there's a whole lot more question marks. There's more guys to pick from, but each of them individually is far more likely to bust. And we do get excited about the round 3 big names, like your Cooper Kupps, like your Chris Godwins. Keenan Allen's been fantastic for a few years as a very good, talented slot receiver. None of these guys are Keenan Allen. This is not the sort of talent we're talking about with these guys here. There's certainly a lot of talent to be had, and I do think that a lot of people are pretty excited about guys like Kyle Williams, who goes into at least a very open depth chart. And we've seen when these guys go into open depth charts, they do get opportunities. We saw that with Deontay Johnson a couple of years ago. Terry McLaurin's made a name for himself because he just didn't have as much competition in those early years. But that at least makes it possible. We've also seen plenty of guys go into open depth charts and ultimately bust. Think of Michael Wilson, for example, who didn't have much competition at all in Arizona, and he still hasn't turned into anything at all. I think that is a very likely outcome for Kyle Williams, who ultimately didn't really deserve to go into that range. He's more of a versatile project player who has some issues with drops. Speaking of project players, and I do think Isaac Tesla has a lot of upside, but we've seen with a lot of upside players in this range, ultimately, a lot of the time they don't turn into anything. We have seen some boom years from some of these guys who were those bigger body players who went to the Lions, think Kenny Golladay. But we know in Tesla's situation, there's plenty of players ahead of him, and it's highly unlikely he is going to play in year one. We have seen players come through and ultimately become very good for fantasy in the long term. Think someone like a Nico Collins, who was very disappointing in the first year or two and then ultimately turned into an excellent fantasy starter. And I think that possibly could even happen with Cedric Tillman, though it hasn't happened yet. I think that's more of the trajectory that we can expect from Tesla than coming in and being a star straight away. There's a lot less to get excited about in the other guys. Pat Bryant goes into a very, very crowded depth chart, and I think he is ultimately in there as just another name who's going to help out. I think it was a big reach to go and get Bryant at this stage, and I feel like he belongs with a lot of the bust names, and I don't think too many people are excited about guys like Jalen Noel and Savion Williams. Ty Felton at least goes into an interesting situation, but a lot of these guys who go into teams as wide receiver 3s ultimately end up staying there, or even worse. We have seen that with guys like Jalen Hyatt, who went in as what we expected to be the wide receiver 3, and ultimately he didn't even rise up to that point. It ended up stuck behind Darius Slayton. Now they brought in better players, but even when there was no one else there, he still couldn't make the breakthrough. I think that's always a risk with someone in the third round. We can get excited about what's happening in the depth chart, but ultimately it does come down to the talent of the player, and none of these guys profile like the top guys on this list. I think Tesla is potentially the exception to that, but I think it's unlikely that's what occurs unless Jamison Williams gets traded away, which is, I think, what would happen if Tesla really impresses. As we head into the 4th and 5th round, and it gets a lot sketchier, we have seen some hits recently in this range. Puka Nacua, who I have to shout out my mate Kiwi, who works on the site with me. He called Puka Nacua straight out of the gate. The moment he got drafted, he said Nacua is going to be a stud, and he was 100% correct. He also said the same thing about Isaiah Pacheco, and his guy this year is Brashard Smith. I'm just letting you know, in case you want to get a little bargain there. Obviously, Nacua has been excellent. Amon-Ra St. Brown has also been very good. None of these guys profile like those players. ultimately we're going to have a lot of busts in this range, a lot of guys that were drafted as wide receivers that are going to play on special teams. But at least there's some upside here. Think about someone like an Arian Smith, who goes to the depth chart. He really only has one competitor ahead of him. Of course, I'm talking about Garrett Wilson. There is Alan Lazard there. There's Josh Reynolds there. But if Smith shows up, he's going to go straight past them very quickly. And we have seen players do that. Think someone like a Romeo Dobbs turned into a good fantasy starter simply because he turned up and looked solid on day one. Plenty of players have done that sort of thing. And I can imagine it happening with Smith because the opportunity's at least there. That doesn't make it a guarantee, but at least there's an opportunity. Same thing with the Tennessee guys. Guys like DK and Iomanor, of course, who I think arguably could have been taken a lot higher, go into an opportunity where it's just Calvin Ridley and a couple of 30-plus-year-olds on the depth chart. Now, to be fair, most of those guys are going to bust. It's very, very, very unlikely going to turn into fantasy superstars. But at least they have an opportunity. And when you do this, not every single player is equally rated. Someone like a Jalen Lane, for example, definitely more of a special teams player. Jordan Watkins, no one is getting excited about because he's very likely to end up further down the list because of how they're going to use him. There is clearly some upside here, though. Even someone like a Torrey Horton, who was taken in the 5th round, at least goes into a depth chart where the number 3 is Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I know he had a good season last season, but if Torrey Horton can have a good OTA, he's going to get himself some opportunities. He probably won't, but at least there's the possibility there, and that's what you're looking for a dynasty stash, especially if you have a taxi squad. Now, it's not great in rounds 4 and 5, but it's way uglier in rounds 6 and 7. If you're in round 6 and 7, you are looking for, at best, Juwan Jennings. That's kind of the upside there. And Jennings was very good last year, but he's essentially the only player in the last 10 years. I ended up looking back because I already had 100 players. I didn't need to look further back. That's even looked close to being something fantasy relevant. I think Russell Gage is probably the only other player that I think you could argue is similar to this. He at least had a top 40 finish and was top 60 in 3 seasons. No other player has been fantasy relevant for at least 3 seasons, which is really depressing. I think Noah Brown's probably the next on that list. I know some of these guys pop up and they look interesting a little bit and they're at least familiar names. These are not guys you want to be spending picks on unless you absolutely have to. The guys in the earlier rounds are definitively going to have a much higher chance of being good for fantasy. There are so many wide receivers drafted in the NFL that once you get into the 6th and 7th round and into the undrafted free agents, most of those guys are going to do absolutely nothing. We can see that here. 95% of these guys haven't even had a top 60 fantasy finish. You don't need those guys on your fantasy roster. I know people are going to get excited about a Tez Johnson, for example. Tez Johnson is very small. He is not going to be good for the NFL because of that. I know someone like a Caden Prather at least goes into an opportunity where there's openings on the Buffalo depth chart. But when we talk about a big guy who was drafted in the 7th round, that's a project player. Nothing's going to happen in the near future, and the odds of him turning into anything are very low. Don't get overexcited about 6th and 7th rounders. It just so rarely hits that it's not worthwhile spending up on them. You're better off going for a player that you at least know has a role. For example, I'm sure instead of getting any of these guys, you could very easily get Ray McLeod now. He's not on most fantasy rosters, and yet we at least know he's the wide receiver 3 for Atlanta. And if there's an injury there, he probably turns into the wide receiver 2, and he has some fantasy value as he did at times last year. Same thing with a Kayshon Boutte, who actually looked okay at times last year. He at least has an opportunity. We know what we can get from him. Most 6th and 7th rounders will be off your roster by next year. You can go and pick up a guy who's a former 6th or 7th rounder, and at least there's some upside there because most of the time, first year, you just have no idea what you're going to get, and you're kind of shooting ducks in the dark. Now, let's have a look at my wide receiver rankings. It's going to surprise a lot of people, but of course, this is for Dynasty. Ted McMillan is the number 1 guy for me. Travis Hunter, I think, is the better player. My concern here is that Hunter probably plays a year or two, and then there's question marks. Should he stay as a wide receiver, or does it make more sense for him to play full-time as a cornerback? For me, in my opinion, it's a lot easier to play every down as a cornerback and then play occasional snaps as a wide receiver because you can dictate what you're going to be doing on the offense. You can decide what sort of play it is. You're going to have to teach Hunter to deal with every single type of defensive play, not necessarily every down and distance, but certainly anything that the offense could do. Whereas with an offensive situation, you can just run it, get him to run certain routes and teach him to do that and then bring him out on the field for those. It's such an easier thing to do. For that reason, I think there's a massive amount of risk with Hunter relative to McMillan. McMillan, to be fair, is certainly not a guaranteed hit either. And I can see the argument for taking all four of the top running backs ahead of him in your rookie draft. It really depends on the setup as to how many wide receivers and how many running backs you're taking in your drafts. If you're unsure what to do in your rankings around whether to take a running back versus a wide receiver, you can hit me up for some personalized rankings. I will do them for a very cheap fee. You can check out the website over at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and I will put a list together specifically for your team and for your league, for your rookie drafts or your dynasty drafts, or indeed as the season gets closer for your redraft leagues as well. Now, behind McMillan and Hunter, I like Matthew Golden a little bit better than Igbuka, but that's because I can see a cleaner situation to go into. I can imagine a situation where he goes in as the number one receiver. And why I don't rate him particularly highly, I think they got a little bit excited about his speed and what they want to do with him. I at least think there's a clear opportunity. They don't have an amazing tight end or running back as a receiver. There's no one else out there who's going to be a clear alpha. We know that Reed is their nominally number one target getter, but he's only out there on 3 wide receiver sets, which means Golden should be the top receiver in this situation. Now, we have seen that players drafted in his range certainly have a bigger bust rate, and I think that's a possibility there with Golden. But I think that's more likely with Igbuka, who goes in as arguably the wide receiver 3 if Godwin's not healthy, and maybe even as the wide receiver 4 behind McMillan initially. I know everyone thinks because he's a first-round pick, he just initially goes in ahead of McMillan, but we have seen plenty of situations where that's not the case. And if you go back to that list I looked at earlier, there were plenty of players who never even got into the starting lineup. So it is possible that Igbuka is a total bust. I think there's more risk with that than there is with Golden. It gets a lot uglier as we go down. Luther Burden, for example, I think could get a lot of targets, but he is competing against very talented players. Odunze is a very good top 10 pick, and we saw how successful top 10 picks are likely to be. It was a far stronger draft class last year, so Odunze being a top 10 pick is more valuable last year than it is this year. And so he should be considered ahead of Burden for that reason, despite the role he goes into. There is an argument to suggest that Ben Johnson loves using his slot guys, but that's because his slot guy was Amon-Ra St. Brown. He was his best player. That's not the case here. He's got DJ Moore. He's got a heap of other options there. He doesn't have to use Burden. Burden could arguably be the number 4 or even the number 5 behind Colson Loveland and DeAndre Swift in this offense. Trey Harris, well, there's a lot of risk here because Quentin Johnston is nominally the number 1 outside receiver, and we know that Ladd McConkey is the true number 1 in this offense. An offense that wants to run the ball a lot and also wants to get their tight ends involved a little bit. They have brought in some new tight ends as well. So that means that Harris is going to have to fight to get through. Now, this could happen, and I can see a Devontae Adams style build as he's pretty disappointing the first year or two and then slowly builds into being the alpha receiver in this offense. So for that reason, I'm willing to take a shot on him, and I feel like there's more chance of that happening than Jaden Higgins hitting, where Higgins is kind of playing with another guy who kind of plays similar to him. We know that Nico Collins is a clear number 1 alpha receiver, big-bodied guy, and Higgins is that same sort of player. They're essentially playing similar roles, and it's going to be really hard for Higgins to get past Collins, at least initially. So for that reason, Higgins is further down my rankings than Harris is. Jack Beck is someone I'm not particularly excited about, but he is ultimately a second-round guy going into a very weak depth chart with the Raiders. The problem with the Raiders in general, they've got Ashton Jeanty. He's going to get a lot of volume as a runner and also going to get some work as a receiver. You've got Brock Bowers, who's the clear, actual number 1 receiver in this offense. And then you've got Jacoby Myers, who's massively underrated and ultimately ends up as roughly the wide receiver 30 every year. That means that Beck is probably at best going to be the 3rd receiver in this offense, maybe number 4. So that makes things pretty ugly for him, especially with Trey Turner actually looking pretty good towards the end of last year. I talked about Kyle Williams and Isaac Tesla plenty, so we're going to move on from them and look a little bit deeper. I do like Arian Smith. I know he's a 4th-round guy instead of a 3rd-round guy, and that does mean something. But I also think there's not that much difference between where he's being picked. Ultimately, he's only being picked within 10 picks off the 3rd round. I do think Smith has some upside on a weak depth chart. If you're going to be picked in the 4th or 5th round, you want to be in these first few picks as Amon-Ra St. Brown was. DK, I think, goes into that same situation. I like him a lot more than Imanor. The fact that they drafted both, but they drafted DK first, tells you what they think of those players. Now, to be fair, we have seen teams draft 2 players from the same position and end up using the 2nd drafted guy a lot more. That is very possible, but I do think DK has the upper hand at the moment. Ty Felton at least has an opportunity in that Minnesota situation. I think Pat Bryant, it's only because he's drafted in the 3rd round that I'm even considering him. It's an ugly, ugly situation where there's a lot of guys on that depth chart. He could arguably not even make the roster. I think he probably does in year one, but I think it's going to be very hard to get past all the guys they've got on the roster. They seem relatively satisfied with those guys. I don't know what they're doing with Brian. It feels like a little bit of a reach to me. Jalen Knoll, again, goes into a very crowded depth chart. I think this tells us a lot about how they feel about Tank Dell and his injury. They just need a lot more depth there at the moment. Savion Williams has a little bit of upside, but Green Bay's depth chart is pretty packed, and Williams is very much a project player. I can't imagine him coming in and being an alpha straight away, but he at least has a little bit of upside. Outside that top 16, I'm not excited about any of these guys. I think Royals could ultimately end up being a just special teams player. We've certainly seen the Chiefs waste a lot of mid-round picks on wide receivers, and I can see that happening here. KLS, again, some upside there, but I think in this situation, there's plenty of other talented receivers with the Chargers. Just there's a weaker depth chart below those top three guys, and I feel like he's at least going to get opportunities to make the roster and maybe do something from here. Already talked about the Titans guys, and Jalen Lane, I think he's probably a special teams guy, but if he can work his way into that slot role, I think there are going to be opportunities here. So there's at least a possibility that he can make something happen there. And that's all we've got for my wide receiver what to expect show. If you got any questions, please hit us up on Instagram or on Twitter or in the comments below. It would also be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube as we try to build the channel. Plus, if you've got any questions, please make sure you hit me up. You can also find my articles over at Razzball, and of course, my full rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Looking forward to catching you guys soon for the tight end show on the Fantasy First Down.